Late afternoon, Western Europe, 1944. The sky is low and grey, pressed flat by winter cloud. Smoke still hangs in the air where an aircraft has gone down, blackened metal scattered across a frozen field. The sharp smell of burned fuel lingers, mixing with damp earth and cold iron. Somewhere in the distance, engines fade. The battle has moved on. On the ground, a single pilot moves carefully through the wreckage of his war. His P-51 Mustang, once fast, sleek, dominant, is finished. Its wings are torn open. The cockpit is empty. The machine that carried him across hostile skies will never fly again. He is alive, but he is surrounded. This is enemy territory. German patrols are nearby. Every road, every farmhouse, every sound carries danger. Standard procedure offers only grim options: evade, hide, surrender, or be captured within hours. Then the pilot sees something that should not be possible. Beyond the trees, on a nearby airfield, enemy aircraft sit exposed, fighters fueled, armed, and waiting, machines designed to hunt him, to kill men like him. In that moment, survival becomes a calculation measured not in courage, but in seconds, and one unthinkable decision begins to take shape, one that will carry him back into the sky, inside a plane meant to destroy him. By the time this pilot's Mustang fell from the sky, the air war over Europe had reached a brutal maturity. What began in 1942 as tentative daylight bombing had evolved into a sustained campaign of industrial destruction. By 1943 and 1944, the United States Army Air Forces were sending hundreds, sometimes thousands, of heavy bombers deep into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. Their targets were not frontline troops, but the engines of war itself: aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, rail hubs, and power stations. Early on, these bombers paid a terrible price. German fighters tore into unescorted formations with discipline and precision. The Luftwaffe still possessed experienced pilots, advanced aircraft, and a well-developed air defense system built around radar, flak belts, and layered interception zones. American losses were unsustainable. The solution arrived not as a bomb, but as an escort. The North American P-51 Mustang was not the first American fighter, but it was the one that changed everything. Equipped with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and long-range drop tanks, the Mustang could do what earlier fighters could not: stay with the bombers all the way to their targets and back again. It was fast, agile, heavily armed, and most importantly, present for the entire mission. By early 1944, P-51 units were operating from airfields across England, sweeping ahead of bomber formations, hunting German interceptors before they could reach the bombers. For the first time, the Luftwaffe was being forced to fight on unequal terms. The results were decisive. German fighter losses mounted, training pipelines collapsed, fuel shortages grounded squadrons, veteran pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced. By the summer of 1944, air superiority over Western Europe had shifted decisively to the Allies. But air superiority did not mean safety. German anti-aircraft guns, flak, remained deadly, so did isolated pockets of experienced fighter pilots. Missions still went wrong, engines failed, hits accumulated, and when a Mustang went down over the continent, the pilots' war changed instantly. American fighter pilots were trained for this moment. They memorized evasion routes, carried silk maps and escape kits, learned basic phrases in local languages. Their chances depended on terrain, timing, and luck. Most never made it back. As the strategic bombing campaign intensified, the skies grew crowded with wreckage, American and German alike. And somewhere amid that chaos, one mission would end not with capture or death, but with a decision so improbable that it exposed the fragile seams in a collapsing enemy system. That mission began like hundreds of others. By late 1944, Germany's air war was being fought under conditions its planners had never anticipated. The Luftwaffe was no longer the confident force that had dominated the skies in 1939 and 1940. Fuel shortages crippled flight training. Replacement pilots were rushed through shortened programs, often with only a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors had logged. Aircraft production continued, but machines alone could not compensate for the loss of experienced airmen. Many newly built fighters never left their dispersal fields, grounded for lack of fuel or crews. At the same time, Allied pressure was relentless. Airfields that once operated behind the safety of the front lines now lay exposed. Strafing runs became routine. American and British fighters attacked runways, parked aircraft, fuel trucks, and hangars. The line between combat zone and rear area blurred into meaninglessness. German airfields adapted as best they could. Fighters were dispersed among trees. Camouflage nets were stretched over wings and fuselages. Security was uneven, adequate on paper, inconsistent in reality. Many bases were understaffed. Ground crews worked under constant threat, sleeping in shifts, reacting to alarms that sometimes proved false, sometimes fatal. For Allied pilots forced down over occupied territory, these conditions created narrow windows of opportunity and extreme danger. A downed airman could still expect rapid pursuit. Civilian reporting networks, military patrols, and the Gestapo all worked to locate escaped flyers. But the system was no longer airtight. Communications broke down. Units relocated without notice. Guards were reassigned or absent altogether. American survival doctrine acknowledged chaos but never suggested exploitation at this level. Pilots were instructed to evade and escape, not to engage further. Enemy aircraft were to be avoided entirely. Identification alone was dangerous. Allied anti-aircraft gunners were trained to fire first at unfamiliar silhouettes. Yet war has a way of forcing decisions outside doctrine. On the ground, a lone pilot assessed his surroundings with the clarity that comes only when options are few. His Mustang was gone. Hiding offered limited prospects. Capture would end his war and possibly his life. The nearest friendly line lay far beyond terrain saturated with enemy movement. And nearby, against every expectation, sat aircraft that represented both the greatest danger and the only remaining means of escape. The Luftwaffe's weakening grip had left cracks in places no one had planned for. Aircraft stood ready that should have been airborne or destroyed. Guards watched skis instead of runways. In the noise of a war nearing its end, the impossible was no longer unthinkable. All that remained was the question of whether a man trained to fight the enemy could risk becoming indistinguishable from one. That question would soon be answered from several angles at once. The human angle. The first enemy the pilot faced was not German, it was time. On the ground, every minute increased the risk of discovery. Adrenaline sharpened the senses, but it also distorted them. Sounds carried farther than they should. Movements felt heavier. Training competed with instinct. American pilots were conditioned to think in terms of formations, fuel states, and escape headings, not solitary improvisation behind enemy lines. Fear was not panic, it was calculation. He understood the consequences of being seen near an operational airfield. Ground crews were armed. Security forces were nearby. One wrong step would end everything. Yet fear also clarified a single truth. Remaining on the ground guaranteed capture. The technological angle. The P-51 Mustang was a predator built for speed, altitude, and range, but now it was useless metal. The aircraft on the field ahead belonged to a different philosophy of war. German fighters were designed for short-range interception, rapid climb, and heavy firepower. They demanded precise handling and intimate familiarity. Cockpits differed. Instrument layouts were unfamiliar. Engine procedures were exacting. A mistake on startup alone could be fatal. But American pilots studied enemy aircraft relentlessly. Recognition manuals, intelligence briefings, silhouettes burned into memory. What he faced was dangerous, but not entirely unknown. The enemy angle. For the German ground crews, war had become exhaustion. Many were teenagers or older reservists. They had watched friends disappear in flames over the Reich. They worked long hours under constant threat of attack. Discipline remained, but vigilance faltered. An Allied pilot in a German uniform would have been unthinkable. A lone figure moving with purpose could pass for something he was not, if only briefly. In that gap between expectation and reality, opportunity existed. What mattered now was not courage alone, but whether the pilot could move, think, and act fast enough before that gap closed. Because the aircraft waiting on the field was not just a means of escape. It was a test of whether knowledge could overcome identity. The tactical angle. Flying the enemy's aircraft was only the beginning. Surviving the airspace beyond the runway was the true challenge. German fighters were optimized for local defense. Their range was limited. Navigation systems were designed for pilots operating from familiar bases, guided by ground control. Once airborne, the pilot would have to orient himself without maps tailored to the aircraft, relying on landmarks, sun position, and memory. Even more dangerous was recognition. From the ground, Allied anti-aircraft gunners were trained to react instantly to German silhouettes. From the air, Allied fighters did not hesitate when encountering enemy profiles. A friendly wave or radio call meant nothing if the aircraft shape was wrong. There would be no second chances. The leadership and doctrine angle. Nothing in Allied doctrine permitted this. Pilots were not trained to impersonate the enemy. The risks were considered unacceptable. Friendly fire incidents were already a constant threat, even under controlled conditions. Leadership understood that survival depended on predictability. Deviating from established patterns introduced chaos, and chaos killed. Yet doctrine was written for systems, not for moments when systems collapsed. What the pilot contemplated was not defiance, but adaptation, a calculated violation of every rule meant to keep him alive. The moral angle. The war had stripped choices down to essentials. The moral question was not whether deception was acceptable, it was whether survival justified it. Flying an enemy aircraft risked not only his life, but the lives of those who might mistake him for what he was not. The burden of that risk rested entirely on one man. Still, the alternative was surrender, and surrender offered no certainty. As he approached the aircraft, the decision ceased to be philosophical. Metal, fuel, and timing replaced abstraction. The machine waited, silent and indifferent. And once the engine turned over, there would be no turning back. Because the moment the wheels left the ground, every gun in the sky, friendly or enemy, would judge him by shape alone. The runway stretched ahead. The choice had already been made. The aircraft stood at the edge of the dispersal area, its camouflage dull under the winter sky. The pilot did not hesitate. Hesitation would invite scrutiny. He moved with the economy of someone who belonged there. No running, no sudden gestures. Close now, the details mattered. The propeller blades were intact. The tires held pressure. Fuel caps were secured. The machine had been prepared to fly. Climbing into the cockpit was the most dangerous moment. The interior was cramped, unfamiliar. Labels were in German. Instruments were arranged differently from anything he had flown before. He forced himself to slow down, recalling recognition diagrams studied months earlier. Throttle, magnetos, fuel selector, primer. If a guard was watching, this was where everything ended. The engine coughed once, then again. Smoke puffed from the exhaust. The propeller blurred into motion. The sound was wrong, not the smooth growl of a Merlin, but a harsher mechanical snarl. It was loud enough to draw attention, quiet enough to be overlooked in a base accustomed to constant noise. There were no alarms. He taxied carefully, mimicking the casual pace of routine operations. Each second stretched. Any shout, any signal flare would bring rifles up and lives down. At the runway threshold, he did not look back. The throttle came forward. Acceleration pressed him into the seat. The aircraft handled differently, more aggressive, less forgiving. Airspeed built quickly. The end of the runway rushed toward him. For a heartbeat, the aircraft stayed grounded, heavy with doubt. Then the wheels lifted. The fighter climbed away from the field, banking gently as if on a standard sortie. Below, the airfield shrank. No gunfire followed. No sirens rose. He was airborne. But the most dangerous part of the flight had only just begun. Because now he would have to cross a sky that would recognize him as the enemy. Once airborne, the illusion of safety vanished. The pilot climbed only as much as necessary. Altitude made him visible. Speed offered protection, but it also narrowed reaction time. He flew low, following rivers and roads when possible, using the landscape as cover rather than the sky. Every formation in the distance triggered calculation. German fighters could challenge him for failing to follow orders. Allied fighters could destroy him without warning. Radio silence was mandatory. Any transmission would betray him instantly. The greatest threat came from his own side. Allied pilots were trained to attack first and identify later. They had lost too many friends to hesitation. The aircraft he flew carried the unmistakable outline of an enemy interceptor. Its wings, tail, and engine profile were lethal signatures. As he approached Allied-controlled airspace, the risk intensified. Anti-aircraft batteries guarded crossings and corridors. Their gunners were young, nervous, and precise. A single burst would be enough. There was no standardized procedure for surrendering in the air. Recognition panels were useless. Maneuvers could be misread as hostile. His only hope was timing, crossing at a moment of minimal activity and luck. When the coastline finally appeared, it did not bring relief. Over friendly territory, the danger peaked. Guns tracked him. Fighters closed distance. Somewhere below, someone made a decision. He lowered his landing gear early, rocked his wings in a slow, deliberate motion, reduced power, exposing himself longer than he wanted. Then, miraculously, no fire came. The aircraft descended toward an Allied airfield. Ground crews scattered. Sirens wailed, not as alarms, but as warnings. He touched down hard, bounced once, then rolled to a stop. Engines cut. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then armed soldiers surrounded the aircraft, weapons raised, orders shouted. When the canopy opened, the face beneath it ended the confusion. An American pilot climbed out of a German fighter. The war had delivered one of its rarest outcomes. A man returned not because the system worked, but because it failed in exactly the right places. That failure would echo far beyond the runway. The first reports reached command the next morning, and disbelief swept through the air bases. An American pilot had returned, intact, uninjured and alive, but not in the aircraft he had left behind. Intelligence officers, mechanics and squadron leaders crowded around, studying photographs and sketches. The aircraft he flew was unmistakably German, an operational fighter, fully armed, yet now in Allied hands. The pilot's debriefing was meticulous. Every movement on the ground, every gauge reading, every sound of engines and propellers was recorded. Analysts wanted to know not only how he survived, but how the enemy aircraft performed in American hands. The stolen plane provided more than a personal triumph. It became a treasure trove of technical data. Instruments, cockpit layout, fuel systems, and engine response, all could be analyzed and compared against the P-51 Mustang. For the Luftwaffe, the incident was a minor embarrassment, but the symbolic impact resonated. German pilots and ground crews were reminded of the chaos creeping through their ranks. Security protocols, once considered stringent, were exposed as fallible. In areas where morale was already fragile, stories like this further eroded confidence. One report, later cited in Luftwaffe internal memos, noted simply, "We cannot assume the enemy will act as expected." Within the American forces, the pilot was celebrated quietly. The incident reinforced a lesson drilled into every fighter pilot. Situational awareness and adaptability could be as crucial as courage or firepower. Manuals emphasized evasion, survival, and identification, but nothing could have prepared them for the ingenuity displayed here. Analysts debated whether it was luck, skill, or a combination of both that allowed him to execute the flight. Meanwhile, the aircraft itself became a focal point. Engineers and test pilots studied it extensively, comparing its strengths and weaknesses with Allied designs. The intelligence gleaned informed both tactical decisions and future aircraft development. What had begun as a desperate improvisation on a frozen airfield evolved into an operational asset, contributing to the broader understanding of enemy capabilities. The incident also triggered discussions at higher command levels. How could an airman penetrate an enemy base, start an aircraft, and take off without immediate interception? Reports emphasized the need to tighten perimeter security, reassess airfield protocols, and monitor potential gaps. Yet in the broader chaos of late 1944, these adjustments came slowly. The cracks in the system that made this escape possible were not fully repaired before the war ended. Despite its strategic and intelligent significance, the human story remained at the center. The pilot's return inspired his fellow airmen, not through reckless heroism, but through a demonstration of acute observation, quick decision-making, and calculated risk. It proved that in war, sometimes survival depended on using every tool at hand, including those created by the enemy. In the weeks that followed, the story of the stolen German fighter circulated quietly through intelligence channels and squadron briefings. Officially, it remained classified for years, regarded as an extraordinary case study rather than public news. The pilot, for his part, returned to flying missions in standard Allied aircraft, though his comrades never let him forget what he had done. The lessons were practical. Enemy equipment could be turned to advantage, and situational awareness could outweigh numbers, firepower, or standard protocol. The fate of the aircraft itself was equally remarkable. Unlike many captured or abandoned planes, it was preserved and analyzed. Engineers meticulously tested its engine, control surfaces, and weapon systems. Flight characteristics were logged, providing invaluable insights into German design philosophy. It revealed how the Luftwaffe prioritized climb rate, firepower, and short-range performance over long-range endurance. This intelligence contributed to refinements in Allied tactics, influencing engagement strategies and aircraft development well beyond the war. Meanwhile, the pilot's experience highlighted the fragility of the enemy's operational structure. German airfields, once considered nearly invulnerable to such improvisation, were revealed to have vulnerabilities: understaffed guards, inconsistent discipline, and gaps in observation that could be exploited by a skilled, daring individual. While the broader collapse of the Luftwaffe was already underway, incidents like this reinforced the perception that the enemy's control over its own skies was slipping. Personal accounts later revealed the psychological weight of the flight. The pilot carried with him the memory of each moment on the airfield, each instrument adjusted, each engine start. Surrounded by armed personnel and potential detection at every step, he had experienced a convergence of fear, calculation, and instinct. The return flight became a meditation in motion, one where every decision had to be perfect, because imperfection meant death. Historically, the event stands out as one of the few instances where a downed pilot not only survived behind enemy lines, but turned the enemy's technology against them in real time. In military archives, it is referenced alongside other improbable escapes and acts of ingenuity, not merely as a human story of survival, but as an operational case demonstrating how individual skill and daring could exploit structural weaknesses in even the most disciplined forces. Ultimately, the escape was a convergence of circumstance, opportunity, and decisive action. It reinforced a recurring truth of warfare. Systems and doctrines provide the framework for battle, but the unpredictable improvisation of an individual can redefine outcomes, even if only momentarily. From the ruined airfield to the safe landing strip, one pilot's ingenuity had rewritten the rules of engagement for that moment, leaving a story that would endure in both legend and documented history. War is often measured in strategies, weapons, and numbers, but sometimes it is measured in moments. One man faced with the impossible chose action over surrender, calculation over fear. His flight was not heroic in the cinematic sense, nor was it celebrated with medals at the time. It was an act of necessity, a fusion of skill, knowledge, and human instinct pushed to its limits. The stolen German fighter became more than a machine that carried him home. It symbolized the paradox of technology in war, Tools designed to kill can also preserve life when wielded with understanding. The P-51 had failed him. The enemy plane had offered salvation. In the hands of a single pilot, metal and fuel transcended their intended purpose, and survival became both an art and a science. This story endures because it captures something fundamental about human ingenuity in war. Battles are planned, doctrines are written, and strategies are rehearsed, but the chaos of the battlefield always leaves room for improvisation. In that space, courage is measured not by reckless bravery, but by the clarity to act decisively when the rules no longer apply. Ultimately, the flight reminds us that war is not just machinery and manpower, it is human judgment tested under pressure. The skies of Europe in 1944 were full of danger, but through precise action, observation, and courage, one pilot turned the enemy's strength into his own path home. In doing so, he left a mark not only on military history, but on the enduring story of survival against impossible odds. And as the engines cooled and the aircraft came to rest, the war carried on. But that moment, singular and improbable, remained an enduring testament to the unpredictable interplay between human skill and the machines of war.